Pastor Wills asked me to read Hebrews 2, verses 10 to 18. This is one of the lectionary readings during Advent for the Sunday. It was appropriate for God, for whom and through whom everything exists, to use experiences of suffering to make perfect the pioneer of salvation. This salvation belongs to many sons and daughters whom he's leading to glory. This is because the one who makes people holy and the people who are being made holy all come from one source. That is why Jesus isn't ashamed to call them brothers and sisters when he says, I will publicly announce your name to my brothers and sisters. I will praise you in the middle of the assembly. He also says, I will rely on him. And also, here I am with the children whom God has given to me. Therefore, since the children share in flesh and blood, he also shared the same things in the same way. He did this to destroy the one who holds the power over death, the devil, by dying. He set free those who were held in slavery their entire lives by their fear of death. Of course, he isn't trying to help angels, but rather he's helping Abraham's descendants. Therefore, he had to be made like his brothers and sisters in every way. This was so that he could become a merciful and faithful high priest in things relating to God, in order to wipe away the sins of the people. He's able to help those who are being tempted, since he himself experienced suffering when he was tempted. Pastor.
So I asked Laura to read the Hebrews text. I don't preach from Hebrews very often. It's often too complicated, too difficult to understand. But the alternative reading this morning was the story from Matthew chapter 2, verses 13 to 23, which I'll reference. But they are the passage. They're the verses about the flight to Egypt. Mary and Joseph having to run to Egypt because Herod is killing the children. And this isn't the only. There are various other dark passages, difficult passages to read. But I thought it would be best to read a theologically, academically uncomfortable passage rather than a difficult passage because of the pain that we feel when we contemplate it. I remember when I was younger, there would be passages like this, and I thought, boy, when I'm older, I'll understand them better. When I'm older, when I've studied, when I've heard pastors and professors and read smart books, then I'll be in a better position to understand the difficult texts, the painful texts. And then I got older, and then I moved from my cozy family home, and I went and I lived among the ivory tower, the academic elites, and I studied with them, and I got to understand things deeper, and I could give better explanations of things. Then I got a little bit older, and I had children. And when you've had children, you can't give a simple explanation for the death of children. And I've become more aware of the world around me. So it isn't just the children in the story, then it isn't just the children in the world around me. It's also the children of Ukraine. It's the children of Iraq. It's the children of Bosnia. It's the children of all of these stories that we've heard that we can no longer ignore. It isn't good enough for it to just be a story where we can just take these deaths as concepts, as ideas that we can put in a little box, glean a little bit of learning from, and move on with our lives. These stories are heavy and hard, and they're supposed to be. The theme for Advent this year has been restoration. And there's sometimes it feels like there's a difficult relationship between suffering and restoration. And on a small level, some of us have been feeling that. We have a few people aren't here this morning because of colds and sicknesses. Of course, it's the holidays. We have people who are traveling. We have people who are hosting. But I had largely escaped unscathed for the past few years. I don't know if it's the efficacy of the vaccine, if I somehow have won the genetic lottery or whatever, but I've been healthy until this past few weeks. And I've been home and I've been waiting for my restoration. I was waiting for the morning when I would wake up and I would be clear and free of suffering, free of difficulty. And it hasn't come yet. And I'm waiting for the suffering to end so that I can be restored to my regular activities, so that I can be active again, so that I can enjoy food again. It isn't COVID. I enjoy eating food still. Just when you don't have energy to make food, and you're the one eating the food that you make, it's a lot harder to enjoy eating it when it's such a chore to make it. So we experience that that in between that Laura was talking about before this morning, that we're waiting for our restoration and we find ourselves still stuck in suffering. Now this is a cold. I'm doing all. This may be a man cold, but I think I'm doing all right. I'm not equating my momentary illness with the various heavy forms of suffering that I know many of your households and families have dealt with. But I use it as an illustration of the connection between that reality, our suffering and our restoration. And we sometimes feel like when the suffering ends, then the restoration will begin. We sometimes feel like as long as we are suffering, then our restoration is on hold. It's on pause. We can't wait for that to happen until the suffering ends. And sometimes we even feel a deeper burden in the sense that if we are suffering, then we aren't ready for restoration. Then we maybe don't even deserve restoration. So we live in our suffering and we feel a double pain. Not only is there the suffering of our illness, the suffering of our loss, the suffering of whatever is plaguing us, but then we also feel like if I was better, if I was stronger, if I was more righteous, I could choose to move on from this suffering. So then we feel the suffering, and then we feel the shame of allowing ourselves to feel the suffering. Suffering doesn't mean you aren't ready for or not worthy of restoration. Nor does suffering have to end before restoration can begin. Instead, suffering itself is proof that restoration has begun. Now, this is something I've become convinced of over the last few years. Our human bodies are designed with a message system to tell us when things are wrong. And we can see this at work in various ways, but suffering is one of those examples. When you feel something is wrong, your body responds. You don't have to, your hands don't have to speak about the discomfort they are feeling. A message goes from the back of your hand through your arm up to your brain, and it says, hey, this is wrong. It goes through that same nervous system back, and it pulls the hand away. And if you didn't feel that pain, your hand would stay there and damage would be done. So you don't like the suffering, you shouldn't like the suffering, but because of the suffering, your hand escapes the danger that it was exposed to. Now, I'm not here to baptize all of our suffering. Sometimes the suffering that we experience is a result of our choices. Sometimes the suffering that we experience is the result of other people imposing suffering on us because of their bad choices, because of their failure to act or protect or whatever. Suffering isn't always for the good, but there is a lot to learn from the way that our body processes suffering. But the passage today, there's a connection between suffering and love. Suffering is something we often experience on our own, and we think that we have to suffer on our own before we can be restored unto other people. But suffering sometimes happens by ourselves, but often the root cause happens in the community. Many of you know this by experience. When you open the door to love, you open that same door to suffering. Now, that sounds a little heavy sometimes. Some of you are wanting to see love as this grandiose thing that once you've accepted that real thing, then suffering will be banished. But within the Christmas story, we see these things tied together. Without reading the whole passage, we see after the Magi have returned, they've come, they've brought their gifts, they've relayed their prophetic reading of the stars of the ancient scriptures, wherever they got that. They've relayed that information to the palace in Jerusalem. And they've left probably unaware of what's happening after they've left, although they were also warned in a dream not to go back the way they came. So there was evidence that something was amiss. But they left. And now there's a kingdom who has already received their new king, who's already experienced this miracle, this incredible night that was sung about by angels, that was witnessed by shepherds. They've seen that, they've experienced that, and rumors and whispers and excitement is already bubbling under the surface. But what else is bubbling is fear. King Herod doesn't want to lose his power. King Herod doesn't want to have his family cut off from what is supposed to be what they deserve, is their royal lineage. And so he wants to find out who has been appointed king instead of him. And he wants to do to that king what other kings do to other kings and kill that king. So a message is sent out and soldiers are dispatched to kill the children. But another message is dispatched. Joseph receives a message from an angel that says, "Get out of there. Flee to Egypt." And then the story connects to the other Egypt story in the Bible, the other massacre of children in the Bible. And we see this connection. We feel the pain of that story. We feel the pain of the first story. And we know that we are in there somewhere, not because we've experienced that kind of loss, but because we have felt similar love. Every now and then we see in the news a tragic story of a car accident, or a parent who went to the nursery to wake their child and the child had died in the sleep. We see these heart-wrenching, gut-wrenching stories of pain. Now, every now and then we see a story that is new. The contents of the story we couldn't fathom. The the evils that people inflict on each other, we think, how can that even happen in the mind? But these stories of children getting sick, of children dying, I don't know about you, but I don't find them inconceivable. I conceive of that possibility all the time. When I had children sleeping in cribs in my home, I would wake up sometimes, and the idea would enter my mind somehow that my child was perhaps not breathing and I should go check. And I would go and be completely relieved to find that the child was, in fact, breathing. But why? Where did that idea come from? Where did the idea come from that I, putting my child into the car, that I needed to buckle every possible latch? Because I had envisioned the possibility of a car crash. I had envisioned the possibility of profound loss and suffering, and that awareness motivated me to take extra precautions. That when we arrived at the destination turned out to have been unnecessary, but I had imagined the worst, and so I had protected myself against it. Why? Because I love my children. When I open the door to loving my children, I open the door to the incalculable pain of finding my children harmed or deceased. It's hard to imagine, but the brain works this way. At least mine does, and I'm not sure I'm fundamentally different than any of you. Hebrews chapter 2, which Laura read for us, makes reference to Psalm 22, which is coincidence. This morning we went through the Simple Sunday liturgy, and we also read from Psalm 22. And Psalm 22 is also referenced in another very important part of the Bible. From the cross, Jesus says the words, which I'm sure all of you know, my God, why have you forsaken me? Now, on surface level, then we can say, well, in that moment, Jesus must have felt disconnected from God, and that's why he was saying these independent thoughts about God abandoning him. And we can read deeper theological stuff into it that, well, I guess God had to abandon Jesus on the cross because Jesus himself said that he had been abandoned. But he wasn't having entirely independent thoughts. Jesus was referring back to something. Excuse me. My children enjoy this hobby called rickrolling. Most of you are far too old to understand what that is, which is good. That's fine. But rickrolling means to trick somebody into watching a video or hearing a song, the same song every time. Now, if I were to call up my children and I would say to them, I want to tell you how much I'm committed to you. I want you to know I am never going to give you up. I'm never going to turn around and desert you. Now, some of you would say, wow, profound commitment from a father to their children. But if you know the song that I'm referring to, then you're thinking he's not saying his own thoughts. He's singing a song to them, and maybe even sarcastically. This is what is happening on the cross. This is what is happening when Jesus says, my God, why have you forsaken me? Yes, in that moment, Jesus felt pain and suffering. And in our pain and suffering, we often feel abandoned by God and abandoned by the people closest to us. The rest of Psalm 22, excuse me, plays out as a kind of a dance between these emotions of feeling pain and abandonment, but at the same time holding on to this idea that God loves us and won't abandon us. So I thought I would read from a little bit farther down and connect these thoughts for us. So this is Psalm 22, starting at verse 19. But you, Lord, don't be far away. You are my strength. Come quick and help me. Deliver me from the sword. Deliver my life from the power of the dog. Save me from the mouth of the lion, from the horns of the wild oxen. You have answered. I will declare your name to my brothers and sisters. I will praise you in the very center of the congregation. All of you who revere the Lord, praise him. All of you who are Jacob's descendants, honor him. All of you who are Israel's offspring, stand in awe of him. Because he didn't despise or detest the suffering of the one who suffered. He didn't hide his face from me. No, he listened when I cried out to him for help. This is a beautiful psalm. These are beautiful words recognizing God's presence in our lives. But they follow these other words. This is going back a few, starting in verse 12. Many bulls surround me, mighty bulls from Bashan encircle me. They open their mouths at me like a lion ripping and roaring. I'm poured out like water. All my bones have fallen apart. My heart is like wax. It melts inside me. My strength is dried up like a piece of broken pottery. My tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You've set me down in the dirt of death. Dogs surround me. A pack of evil people circle me like a lion. Oh, my poor hands and feet. I can count my bones. Meanwhile, they stare at me, watching me. They divvy up my garments among themselves. They cast lots for my clothes. This is here. Same psalm, same psalmist, same story. We can find evidence that Jesus would have identified with parts of this. His clothes were divided among the people who were mocking. He felt pain. He was encircled by his enemies. Jesus said the words at the beginning of this psalm because he identified also with the rest of them. This is a story of God experiencing pain because God loves us. This is Jesus experiencing pain while at the same time experiencing the love of his Father. Was Jesus not going to be restored? Was Jesus's ability to feel pain separating him from his task, separating him from who he was supposed to be? No. His pain, like ours, was a part of his story, was a part of who he was called to be. The stories today, the story from Matthew of the children being killed, these stories remind us that in our pain, in our most profound pain, God is with us. And that even though God created a beautiful and powerful world, we are still going to suffer. And in some ways, that suffering is a result of a good and powerful world. When we experience things that are not right, our nervous systems tell us that. And pain is a part of our nervous system, but pain is also part of our spiritual system. Our recognition that things are not as they should be. So in Hebrews, the writer there, who we're not entirely sure who it is, there's an episode of Jeopardy a little while ago, and on Jeopardy they mentioned that they asked the question. Basically, it was written weirdly, but it said, "Who wrote Hebrews?" And the right answer on Jeopardy was Paul. So Bible nerds like me threw up a tizzy over that. But here we find this this presentation of the idea of God suffering for our benefit. So I'll just go back. I know Laura just read it, but I'll look at the first verse again. It was appropriate for God, for whom and through whom everything exists, to use experiences of suffering, the experiences of suffering of Jesus here, to make perfect the pioneer of our salvation. Now, different translations will say different things. Some places it'll say the prince of our salvation, the author of our salvation. The Greek isn't entirely clear, but it kind of hints at the originator. Originator isn't an easy word. I've volunteered at museums before, and sometimes these museums would get tourists from Europe, and they would come to our little museums, and they would say, like, why have you built this museum? And I said, well, you know, people are curious about our history, and these Europeans would say, and this happened more than once, they would say, this is not history. It was only 150 years old. And I've been to Europe, and I've never seen a museum acknowledging the history of 150 years. We have a whole bunch of those museums here. And I wish I had the clarity of mind then, as I do now, to say, well, there are history museums and there are pioneer museums. We want to know what it was like for the pioneers. How did they get by without all the technology that we have? How did they carve a living out of what they thought was a vast and empty wasteland? How did they get by without what we understand now as fundamental necessities? When the writer of Hebrews here is talking about Jesus as the pioneer of our salvation, the originator of our salvation, the author of our salvation. He's talking about Jesus experiencing that suffering, experiencing the profound knowledge of things not being right. And so Christ himself suffered as part of our salvation. He suffered as a part of the love that Christ has for us. When we suffer, we are really, in a lot of ways, experiencing love. But the flip side of it, when we open the door to love, we open the door to our own suffering. When we open the door to family who are visiting from far away, we open the door to the possibility that they will be visiting other people when they're supposed to be visiting us. When we make plans to travel, to host, to feed other people, we open the possibility that little window of time might not work with our health, with somebody else's health, with a transportation system that we have. When we open the door to love, we open the door to suffering. That's not punishment. Suffering isn't punishment. Suffering is us participating in the knowledge that things are not as they should be. But love is what should be. So I'm gonna wrap things up there. But I do want to make sure that you see that connection between love and suffering. And if any of you are holding on to suffering, as I have and am very capable of doing, if you're holding on to your suffering and feeling like, you know, if I could just shake this, my restoration could begin, you are wrong. Suffering and restoration happen at exactly the same time. If your body was incapable of healing, you wouldn't feel an ounce of pain. but it is because your body is capable of healing that you feel the pain of the healing happening.